Tonight, a single drop of raspberry sauce shattered the hushed elegance of Boston's most exclusive restaurant. 3 years of dead silence ended the moment a terrified 6-year-old recognized the symbol on his porcelain plate, instantly turning Minna's life into collateral damage. If one wants to disappear in plain sight, they don't wear a disguise, they wear a uniform. At the Lexington, a Michelin-starred steakhouse nestled in the affluent heart of Back Bay, Boston. Minna's uniform was a starched white apron, a black vest, and an expression of polite invisibility. To the elite patrons who dined on dry-aged Wagyu and truffles, she was just Minna, a competent waitress who always remembered they preferred their martinis stirred, not shaken. They didn't need to know that 3 years ago, she was Dr. Minna Hayes, a leading pediatric trauma psychologist at Boston Children's Hospital. And they certainly didn't need to know that she had faked her own drowning in the Charles River to escape the crosshairs of the O'Rourke crime syndicate after she refused to alter a psychiatric evaluation for one of their capos. She thought she had left the underworld behind. Then, Dominic Gallo walked into her section. The air in the restaurant actually shifted when he crossed the threshold. Dominic was the undisputed head of the Gallo family, a man who controlled the eastern seaboard's shipping ports with ruthless, bloody efficiency. He was a striking man, tall, tailored in a midnight blue Brioni suit, with jawlines cut from granite and eyes the color of a stormy Atlantic. But he wasn't what made her breath catch in her throat. It was the 3 little boys trailing silently behind him. Theo, Silas, and Finn. The Gallo triplets. In the Boston underground, their story was a tragic legend. 2 years ago, their mother, Isabella Gallo, was murdered in their penthouse while Dominic was away on business. The police, led by Commissioner Henderson, officially ruled it a home invasion gone wrong. The streets whispered it was an inside job, a warning to Dominic. But the most horrifying detail of all was that the triplets, then only 4 years old, had been hiding in the walk-in closet. They had seen the killer, and they hadn't uttered a single syllable since. "Table 7, Minna. Don't look him in the eye. Don't ask unnecessary questions," Richard, the floor manager, hissed as he shoved a silver tray into her hands. He was sweating right through his custom collar. "Just pour the water and get the order." Minna approached the table. Dominic sat at the head, his posture rigid, his phone buzzing violently on the table. The 3 boys sat across from him. They were dressed in identical miniature suits, but they looked like ghosts. Their eyes were hollow, their skin pale, their little shoulders hunched inward as if waiting for a blow. "Good evening, gentlemen," she murmured, her voice smooth and practiced. "Sparkling or still?" Dominic barely glanced at her. "Still. Bring a bottle of the 2009 Barolo, and 3 orders of the truffle mac and cheese for the boys. They won't eat anything else." "Right away, sir." As she poured the water, her clinical instincts, dormant for 3 years, screamed to life. She watched the boys closely. Silas, the middle triplet, was staring blankly at the tablecloth, but his right index finger was rhythmically tapping his thumb. Tap, tap, hold, tap, tap, hold. Minna froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. That wasn't a nervous tick. That was an EMDR, grounding technique. Specifically, it was a modified bilateral stimulation anchor used for severe, acute childhood PTSD. It was a technique she had personally developed and published in the Journal of Clinical Child Psychology before she went into hiding. It was highly specialized. How on earth did a Mafia boss's traumatized 6-year-old know it? She walked back to the kitchen, her mind racing. During service, she kept an eye on table 7. Dominic tried to engage them, cutting their food, his face tight with a mixture of fierce love and agonizing helplessness. The boys ate in mechanical, synchronized bites. Not a sound, not a whisper. It was a suffocating, heavy silence that she recognized perfectly. It was the silence of children trapped in a terrifying, psychological prison. When it was time for dessert, Dominic ordered an espresso and 3 vanilla bean panna cottas for the boys. She stood at the plating station in the bustling kitchen. Chef Henry was screaming about undercooked scallops. The heat of the ovens was blistering. But all she could focus on were the 3 white porcelain plates in front of her. Before she disappeared, she had a private, off-the-books patient. A wealthy, terrified woman who came to her under a fake name, desperate for advice on how to protect her children's developing minds from the violent reality of her husband's life. She had taught her a symbol, a secret visual anchor to draw for her kids when they felt overwhelmed, a promise that no matter what happened, they were safe, and they could speak freely without consequence. Could it be? Her hands trembled as she picked up the squeeze bottle of blackberry coulis. It was reckless. It was stupid. It violated every rule of her survival. But looking out the kitchen window at those 3 dead-eyed little boys, the doctor in her overpowered the fugitive. On the rim of each plate, in dark, rich blackberry sauce, she quickly and precisely drew the symbol, a tiny stylized figure 8 overlapping a triangle, the infinity of safety, grounded in the triad of strength. She wiped her hands, picked up the tray, and walked back into the lion's den. She set the plates down one by one. First Finn, then Silas, and finally Theo. Dominic was glaring at his phone, reading a text that made the muscles in his neck bunch. He didn't even look up as she placed his espresso down. "Put it on the black card," he grunted, sliding a heavy metal credit card across the linen. "Enjoy your dessert, boys," she said softly, stepping back to give them space. She intended to walk away. She really did. But her feet felt cemented to the hardwood floor. Theo picked up his silver dessert spoon. He looked down at the creamy panna cotta, and then his eyes drifted to the rim of the plate. He stopped. His breathing hitched. Beside him, Silas and Finn followed his gaze. For a terrifying, agonizing 5 seconds, nobody moved. The boys stared at the blackberry coulis. Then, Theo's hand began to shake. He dropped his spoon. It clattered loudly against the china, a gunshot in the hushed dining room. Dominic's head snapped up, his paternal instincts flaring. "Theo, what's wrong? Are you sick?" Theo didn't look at his father. He reached out with a trembling, tiny finger and traced the figure 8 over the triangle. He looked up, his wide, terrified eyes finding hers across the table. His lips parted. He took a ragged, dusty breath. "Mama." The word was a cracked, fragile whisper, unused for 2 long years. Dominic froze. The 2 massive bodyguards standing near the exit, men who looked like they strangled bears for fun, visibly stiffened. Then Silas pointed at her apron. "She," he croaked, his voice thick with disuse. "She has the safe mark. She knows." Finn, the smallest of the 3, suddenly burst into violent, racking sobs. "Mama said. Mama said when the mark comes, the monsters are gone," he wailed, finding his voice in a sudden rush of overwhelming emotion. "Can we talk now? Is it safe?" The entire restaurant seemed to stop breathing. Waiters halted in their tracks. Patrons lowered their forks. Dominic Gallo looked like a man who had just been struck by lightning. His eyes darted from his crying, babbling sons, who were suddenly speaking in broken, overlapping sentences about their mother, to the plates. He saw the symbol, the color completely drained from the mob boss's face, replaced by a terrifying, murderous pallor. The raw vulnerability vanished, replaced instantly by the apex predator of the Boston Syndicate. "Lock the doors," Dominic said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a serrated blade. Instantly, his bodyguards moved. One locked the heavy mahogany front doors and pulled the shades. The other marched straight toward Richard, the manager, flashing a holstered Glock. "Nobody moves. Nobody calls the cops." Minna took a slow step backward, terror finally icing her veins. She had made a catastrophic mistake. Dominic stood slowly, his massive frame towering over the table. He didn't look at the patrons cowering in their booths. He looked only at her. He rounded the table with slow, deliberate steps until he was standing inches from her face. He smelled of expensive cologne, espresso, and pure, concentrated violence. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice shaking with a rage so profound it vibrated in the air between them. I'm Minna. I'm your waitress." His hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her upper arm like a vice. He didn't yell. That made it so much worse. "My sons haven't spoken a word since the night my wife was slaughtered. Dozens of doctors, top specialists in the country. Nothing. And you serve them a dessert, and suddenly they are talking about their dead mother. I don't know what you're—" He shoved the plate into her face. The blackberry symbol smeared slightly. "Where did you learn this? Tell me right now, or I swear to God, you won't leave this building alive." "It's just a design," she lied, her voice cracking. Dominic pulled her closer, his eyes burning with a manic intensity. "Do not lie to me. That isn't a design. That exact symbol was drawn in my wife's blood on the floor next to her body. It was the only clue the killer left behind." Her world tilted on its axis. No, that wasn't possible. The symbol wasn't a killer's mark. It was Isabella's desperate, dying message to her children. A psychological anchor telling them to stay silent, to stay safe, until someone who knew the truth found them. Isabella had been her secret patient, and the man she was terrified of, the man she had been planning to flee from, wasn't a rival gang. It was a mole inside Dominic's own inner circle. "Daddy, don't hurt her!" Theo suddenly shouted, jumping out of his chair and latching onto Dominic's leg. "Mama told us. She said the lady with the mark is the only one who can keep us safe from the bad uncle." Dominic froze, staring down at his son. "What? What did you just say, Theo?" "The bad uncle," Silas echoed, his small fists clenched, his voice growing stronger. "The one who hurt Mama. He's here." Silas pointed a shaking finger right past Dominic, aiming directly at the towering bodyguard guarding the front door. Dominic's most trusted enforcer, a man named Cole. The temperature in the room plummeted to absolute zero. Cole's hand slowly drifted toward the inside of his suit jacket. Dominic let go of her arm, his body pivoting with terrifying speed. But before he could draw his weapon, the deafening roar of a gunshot shattered the glass of the restaurant's front window. The gunshot didn't just shatter the restaurant's reinforced front window, it shattered the fragile illusion of safety she had built over 3 agonizing years. High-caliber glass rained down on the patrons of the Lexington like deadly diamonds. Screams erupted, a chaotic symphony of terror. Before the first shard even hit the mahogany floor, Dominic Gallo moved with a terrifying primal speed. He didn't dive for cover. He dove over the table, his massive body shielding Theo, Silas, and Finn. Cole, the man the boys had just identified as the bad uncle, didn't flinch at the incoming fire. Instead, he drew his suppressed weapon and aimed it directly at Dominic's exposed back. Minna didn't think. The clinical psychologist vanished, replaced by pure, desperate adrenaline. She grabbed the heavy, solid silver water pitcher from the table and swung it with every ounce of strength she possessed. The heavy metal connected with the side of Cole's skull with a sickening crunch. Cole staggered, his shot going wide, obliterating a crystal chandelier above them. "Move!" Dominic roared, his eyes locking onto hers with a mixture of shock and lethal clarity. He scooped Finn up under one arm, grabbed Silas by the collar, and shoved Theo toward her. "Take him, Minna! Kitchen, now!" She grabbed Theo's small, trembling hand. "5 things you can see, Theo. Focus on my voice," she yelled over the deafening pop of gunfire. "Blue door, silver counter, white chef's hat. Keep counting." It was a rudimentary grounding technique, but it kept the child moving instead of freezing in shock. They tore through the swinging doors of the kitchen, slipping on spilled truffle oil and scattering terrified line cooks. Another bodyguard, a loyalist bleeding from a grazed shoulder, covered their retreat, laying down suppressive fire toward the dining room. They burst through the back service exit into the freezing, biting wind of the Boston alleyway. A black, heavily armored Lincoln Navigator was already idling, its tires smoking on the icy asphalt. Dominic threw the boys into the back seat and grabbed her blood-stained apron, literally hurling her in after them before slamming the heavy ballistic door shut. "Drive. The safe house in the Berkshires. Do not stop for anything, not even the cops," Dominic barked at the driver. The SUV peeled out onto Storrow Drive, the city lights blurring into a neon streak. The silence in the cabin was suffocating, broken only by the ragged breathing of the 3 boys and the frantic thumping of her own heart. Dominic slowly turned around from the passenger seat. In the dim glow of the streetlights, his face was a mask of absolute, calculated fury. He reached over the center console, his hand gripping the cold steel of his firearm, the barrel pointing directly at her chest. "You saved my life back there," Dominic said, his voice a lethal, low register. "But that doesn't change the fact that you know things you shouldn't. You knew my wife's dying message. You knew my son's trauma triggers. Who the hell are you, Minna? And if you lie to me, I will throw you out of this moving car." Theo whimpered, burying his face in her side. Without thinking, she wrapped her arms around the boy, her glare meeting the Mafia boss's icy stare. "Put the gun down, Dominic. You're terrifying your children," she snapped, her authoritative clinical voice returning. Dominic's eyes widened fractionally. Nobody spoke to the head of the Gallo Syndicate like that. But he looked at Theo clinging to her and slowly, reluctantly, lowered the weapon. "3 years ago, my name was Dr. Minna Hayes," she began, her voice trembling but resolute. "I was the chief of pediatric trauma psychology at Massachusetts General Hospital. I specialized in children who had witnessed extreme violence." Dominic's jaw clenched. "I remember the news. Dr. Hayes drowned in the Charles River. Her car went off the bridge." "I faked it," she confessed, holding Silas's trembling hand as he reached across the seat for her. "I was evaluating a teenage boy, a low-level runner for the O'Rourke Syndicate. He witnessed a murder ordered by his bosses. The O'Rourkes demanded I alter my psychiatric evaluation to discredit him so he couldn't testify. When I refused, they put a hit out on me. So I disappeared. I became Minna the waitress." "And Isabella?" Dominic demanded, his voice cracking slightly on his late wife's name. "Isabella came to me under an alias, heavily disguised," she whispered. "She was terrified. Not of a rival family, Dominic. She was terrified of your inner circle. She had uncovered a conspiracy. Someone high up in your organization was feeding information to the O'Rourkes, plotting to overthrow you. She knew she was being watched, so she begged me for a psychological failsafe for the boys. A way for them to signal for help if the worst happened, without alerting the traitor." "The symbol," Dominic breathed, realization crashing over him. "The figure 8 over the triangle, a closed loop of safety. I told her to draw it only if it was a matter of life and death, so the boys would know they could speak the absolute truth without fear. When she died, they locked the trauma inside, terrified that the bad uncle would kill them too if they spoke. Tonight, I saw Silas tapping his fingers. A bilateral stimulation technique I taught Isabella to help them manage anxiety. I gambled and drew the symbol. Dominic slumped back against the leather seat, running a shaking hand over his face. The ruthless mob boss was gone. In his place was a grieving husband and a horrified father who realized his blind trust in his men had cost his wife her life. Cole, Dominic whispered, the name tasting like ash. He was my right hand. He was supposed to be guarding the penthouse the night she died. He said he was incapacitated. He lied. He let the O'Rourkes in. And now, she said softly, Cole knows the boys can identify him. He knows they saw his face that night. He's not going to stop hunting us. The drive out of Boston was a masterclass in evasive, high-stakes maneuvering. They bypassed the Mass Pike entirely, their heavily armored Lincoln Navigator tearing through a labyrinth of unmarked logging roads until they reached Dominic's fortress, a brutalist compound of poured concrete and reinforced steel tucked deep into a snow-choked valley near Mount Greylock in the Berkshires. It wasn't just a house, it was a modernized citadel. Marco, Dominic's newly appointed head of security, barked sharp orders into a tactical radio, coordinating a heavily armed perimeter defense with men carrying Heckler and Koch MP5s. Inside the compound, the adrenaline crash hit the boys with devastating force. Minna immediately converted the sprawling, mahogany-paneled library into a makeshift clinical space. Pushing aside a priceless Persian rug, she helped the boys build a massive fort out of leather sofa cushions and heavy down comforters. The enclosed, dark space offered them a tangible, immediate sense of physical control, a necessary grounding technique after a violent sensory overload. For the next 48 hours, the disguise of Minna, the invisible waitress, melted away entirely. She was Dr. Hayes again. The dam had finally burst, and the boys' voices, rusty, fragile, but relentless, filled the quiet room. She used a specialized technique called narrative exposure therapy, letting them dictate the pace of their memories using a set of oversized sketching pads she found in Dominic's office. Finn, the youngest and smallest, clutched a blue crayon so hard his knuckles turned white. He came through the back door, Finn whispered, his voice trembling as he drew a jagged black square on the paper. The bad uncle, Cole. Mama told him to take the black book and leave us alone. She said he could have all the money, but he laughed at her. Dominic stood in the shadows of the library doorway, listening. He looked physically ill, a man being slowly torn apart from the inside. The imposing, ruthless Mafia Don was reduced to a hollowed-out, agonizingly guilty father, absorbing every horrific detail of his wife's last moments and his own catastrophic failure in judging the character of his right-hand man. When Silas softly mentioned how Cole had smiled before raising his weapon, Dominic turned away, bracing his massive frame against the door jamb, as if he'd just taken a bullet to the chest. Later that night, the compound was suffocatingly quiet, the silence broken only by the howling wind battering the reinforced glass. She left the boys sleeping peacefully under the watchful eye of a female bodyguard named Rosa and padded down to the industrial-grade kitchen. Dominic was there, silhouetted by the moonlight reflecting off the snow outside. A bottle of Macallan 25 sat untouched on the marble island next to a disassembled Sig Sauer pistol. He was methodically cleaning the weapon, his hands moving with lethal, practiced precision. "You should be resting, Dr. Hayes," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. "Occupational hazard," she replied, crossing her arms over her borrowed, oversized cashmere sweater. "Adrenaline takes a while to metabolize." He set the slide of the gun down and looked up. The raw vulnerability in his stormy Atlantic eyes was jarring, a stark contrast to the violence of his world. They haven't stopped talking for 2 days, 3 years of absolute silence, dozens of doctors, and you broke it with a spoonful of blackberry sauce. I just gave them permission to feel safe, she said softly, stepping closer to the island. They did the hard work, Dominic. Children are incredibly resilient when they know they aren't carrying the burden alone. Dominic closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He smelled of gun oil, expensive scotch, and a desperate kind of exhaustion. He stopped mere inches from her, his towering frame casting a protective shadow over her. He reached out, his calloused fingers hovering just millimeters from her cheek before gently tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The air between them cracked with a palpable, electric heat, heavy with the shared trauma and the undeniable pull of survival. "You saved my sons," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips before rising to meet her eyes with searing intensity. "And you saved me from living the rest of my life next to the man who murdered my wife. How do I even begin to repay that? I don't want your money, Dominic. I just want my life back. I want to stop looking over my shoulder." "I can give you that," he promised, his thumb gently brushing her jawline. "And maybe—" "Boss!" Marco's voice shattered the quiet, booming through the kitchen doorway. Proximity alarms on the southern ridge are tripped. Thermal imaging shows a dozen hostiles moving through the tree line. It's Cole. He didn't run. He brought O'Rourke's heavy hitters to finish the job. The tender, fragile moment evaporated instantly. Dominic's eyes went dead, the apex predator violently taking the reins. He racked the slide of his Sig Sauer, the metallic clack echoing off the tile. "Take her and the boys to the sub-level bunker. Now, lock the vault and do not open it until you hear my voice." Marco grabbed her arm, practically dragging her up the stairs to gather the boys from the library. Minutes later, the 4 of them were sealed inside a subterranean panic room, encased in 2 feet of titanium and concrete. The air was stale, filtering through heavy HEPA vents. Above them, the muffled, rhythmic thud of suppressed gunfire and the concussive boom of flashbang grenades vibrated violently through the floorboards. She huddled in the center of the cold room, pulling Theo, Silas, and Finn into a tight, desperate embrace. She started tapping a rhythmic, bilateral beat on their shoulders, forcing her clinical training to override her terror. "Breathe with me," she chanted softly, locking eyes with each of them. "In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. We are safe in the box. The monsters cannot get in the box." An hour passed in the dark. It felt like a decade of agony. Every distant thud was a question mark hanging over Dominic's life. Finally, the heavy locking mechanisms of the vault door ground open with a metallic shriek. Dominic stood in the doorway. His bespoke shirt was torn and stained, his knuckles were split and bloody, and a dark bruise was already blooming along his jaw. But his eyes were clear, and the heavy weight that had rested on his shoulders for 2 years was gone. "Cole is dead," Dominic stated, his voice devoid of emotion as he dropped a burner phone onto the steel table. "And before they cut the hard lines, I sent the encrypted ledger data Isabella hid to Commissioner Henderson at the FBI. The O'Rourke family is currently being raided across the city. It's over." Minna let out a ragged sob, the tension completely leaving her body. Dominic stepped into the room and fell to his knees on the concrete, dropping his weapon. He wrapped his massive, bruised arms around her and his 3 sons, pulling them into a tight, unbreakable circle of survival. Burying his face in her neck, the ruthless Mafia boss finally let out a shaky breath, holding on to the family he thought he had lost, and the woman who had helped him find them again. The clinking of silver no longer masked secrets. only the sound of a family healing. In the heart of Dominic's fortress, Minna found the one thing she never expected: a home. The O'Rourke syndicate fell, and the Gallo empire transformed. Theo, Silas, and Finn finally had their voices back, and the ruthless Mafia boss who once terrified her was now the man she trusted with her life. They survived.